very much. Wonderful, wonderful. Shall we turn to God's Word together? We're going to, so many of you know we've been on in a series looking at the book of Galatians. We're going to come back to that series next week. Rachel's going to speak next week on Galatians 5. We're just going to take a pause from that this week while I just take an opportunity to follow up on some of the things that Matt shared with us last week while he was visiting. And if you've been around church for a little while, you've probably heard a little bit about our vision and our heart. You've seen the signs that talk about restoring you and rebuild. And I like to, when I'm talking about vision for the church, use a picture of the Atacama Desert, which I think we'll have on the screen, which is the hottest, most barren place in the world. Nothing grows here. But one day, a couple of years ago, there was a year's worth of rain in 24 hours. And under the surface of the Atacama Desert are thousands and thousands of plants that are laid dormant. And when the water came, all of these flowers sprung to life. And in the middle of the desert, there was new life growing. And I think there's a second picture as well. And I just think this is a really great visual representation of our heart for the town of Chesterfield. Chesterfield itself can feel fairly barren and fairly hard, like a lot of English towns, but we have a heart to see this kind of life and birth coming to Chesterfield through the power of God's Holy Spirit, through the good news of Jesus. And that's our heart and our vision in a nutshell. And when I was thinking about this picture and what Matt shared about last week, I thought we might spend a little bit of time in a really obscure passage in the Old Testament. So if you want to turn with me to the book of Judges, we're going to look at Judges chapter 4. And the book of Judges, it comes after Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and then Joshua. Joshua is when the people of Israel go into the promised land. And then Judges is the people of Israel learning to live in the land and the inheritance that they've been given by God. But as you read through the book of Judges, what you find is this downward trajectory that the people of Israel are going further and further away from God's ways. So in Judges chapter 2, it says that a new generation of people came up who didn't know the Lord and didn't know all the things that the Lord had done for the people. And in reality, we live in a world where that's also true. And then there's a refrain all the way through the book of Judges, and the book of Judges ends with this refrain. It says, there was no king in those days, and so everybody did whatever they felt was right in their own eyes. That's the definition of sin and evil in the book of Judges. Everybody deciding that they're just going to do whatever they feel like is right in their own eyes. And I think that's a great definition, an observation of what's happening in our country and in our generation. Everybody says, I'm just going to live however I want, and I'm going to do whatever feels right to me. I'm going to live my best life now. I'm going to do whatever I feel, whatever I want, I'm going to act on that. The book of Judges says that's the definition of sin. And in Judges chapter 4, we'll be here, it starts by saying this. It says, and the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. That's how the story starts. The people of Israel are getting it wrong. But at the same time, we see in this story that their story starts with their sin and their failure. The reality is that's true of us as well. Our story always begins with human weakness and human failure and human sin. And it's at that point that Jesus steps into our story when we recognize our own inadequacies, the things that we've done wrong, the way that we've failed, the way that we've sinned, the way that we need a saviour and a good king who will lead us and direct us, and we can follow after him. That's where their story begins, that they fail. But our story, our Christian journey, always begins as well in that same place that we fail, that we get it wrong, that we need forgiveness, and that we need a saviour. And then in this story, what happens is a huge army comes against the people of Israel. It's the Canaanite king, and he has 900 chariots, which are in modern day terms, they're the Tomahawk jets or the tanks or whatever. They're the big military killing machines, and there's 900 against them. It looks hopeless, and they come against Israel. So what Israel do, and they get this right, is they cry out to the Lord. So it says in verse 3, the people of Israel cried out to the Lord for help. They got this right. They saw the size and the scale of the problem that they faced, and so their natural response was to cry out to God for help. And my question to us, maybe as a church, is have we seen the scale of the problem that we face in Chesterfield and Derbyshire and England and in our world? You know, there are 120,000 people in Chesterfield. Most of them do not know the message of Jesus and the way to salvation in his name. Most of them don't. Most metrics suggest that if you have a town or a place that has 2% evangelical Bible-believing Christians, then that can begin to make a tangible difference in the town. There would be about 2,500 people. And as I look around the churches in Chesterfield, their size, their scale, I struggle to imagine whether there are 2,500 Bible-believing Christians in Chesterfield. And often the issue is we've just not seen the scale of the problem, how big it is, and how great the need for Jesus is in this town. It's huge. It's massive. And that's why we can learn from this story, because what the people of Israel did here is they cried out to God. That was their natural response. William Booth, who was the founder of the Salvation Army, he once received a letter from a church planting couple. And they wrote to him and they said, look, we've tried everything with this group of people. We've tried charity drives, we've tried mission and outreach and sharing the gospel and food. We've tried everything. What can we do to reach this town for Jesus? And William Booth wrote back with just a 4-word reply and said, have you tried tears? And have we tried coming to that point where we're actually crying out to God for a breakthrough in the town of Chesterfield? And then what happens as we carry on this story? We see the lady Deborah comes on the scene, and it says, now Deborah, a prophetess. James, is there any chance you could turn this down? I feel like it's booming. Thank you, mate. The wife of Lapidoth was judging Israel at that time. She used to sit under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. And the people of Israel came up to her for judgment. She sent and summoned Barak, the son of Abinoam, from Kedesh Naphtali, and said to him, has not the Lord, the God of Israel, commanded you, go and gather your men at Mount Tabor? What I want to say here is this story then continues. God gives Barak and Deborah a strategy and a plan. He's the one who gives them the directions of what to do. They don't come up with their own clever idea of how to defend themselves in the situation. What they do is they seek the Lord and ask for his strategy and his plan and his purposes. They go to God and ask for his strategy. And it struck me actually that their strategy is really similar to the strategy of a church. Their strategy is to go and to gather. To go and to gather. And I thought those two words were quite significant for us to dwell on. Because as a church, we place a big emphasis on gathering together, rightly coming together in worship here, praising Jesus, and it's really important to be a part of a local church. I don't think there's any way that you can read the New Testament and conclude that local Christians aren't meant to be a part of a local church. Gathering together is really important. But at the same time, so is going. So is going into the workplace, into the marketplace, into the areas of influence, into the streets and the highways and byways, and proclaiming the message of Jesus through the things that we do. The going aspect is really important. And it struck me that God's strategy here in the book of Judges and our strategy as a church are very similar. We're called to gather together and we're called to go. And interestingly, on that point, there are two kind of famous lakes or oceans or seas in Israel. One of them called the Sea of Galilee, and one of them called the Dead Sea. You've probably heard of them. And the Sea of Galilee is teeming with life and fertility. People can make a living off of the ocean by fishing and collecting wildlife. But the Dead Sea is quite literally dead. Nothing grows there. And the difference between the two is that both of them have water going into them, but only the Sea of Galilee has a natural overflow. Only the Sea of Galilee has water that can naturally overflow out. The Dead Sea doesn't, and so the water just stays there and becomes stagnant and things die. The difference is they both gather water together, but only one of them allows it to flow out and go out. And that's what brings natural life and vitality. And so for a church that only ever focuses on gathering, then we're missing a part of God's equation and plan and strategy for what it means to be an effective witness to Jesus in this town. And then carrying on with this story, not only does God give the strategy, the promise goes on like this. It says, "Go, gather your men at Mount Tabor, taking 10,000 from the people of Naphtali and the people of Zebulun." And this is God speaking. He says, "And I will draw out Sisera, the general of Jabin's army, to meet you by the river Kishon with the chariots and his troops, and I will give him into your hand." The next thing we see is not only does God give the strategy, but God gives his support to the people of Israel. He gives his presence and his power. And all the way through the Old Testament and the New Testament, we see that God promises his presence with his people on the basis of an impossible assignment that he's given them to do. And all the way through the Bible, we see examples of the way God works is not primarily to ask us to help him, but to offer his strong support and his power to his people. One of my favourite verses in the Bible is Acts 17:25. It's a great verse if you want to put one on your wall or get a tattoo if that's your kind of thing or whatever. It's a great verse. It's a bit long, but Paul says in that verse that God doesn't live in human temples built by human hands to be served by people as if he needed anything, but instead he himself gives to all men everywhere life and breath and everything else. That's the kind of God we've had. He's not primarily looking for people to serve. He's primarily looking to give life and breath and everything else. 2 Chronicles 69, it says, "The eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole world to give strong support." Another translation says, "to show himself mighty on behalf of those who wait for him." That's the way, that's the setup. If God's looking right now for people who are willing to wait for him, and his purpose is to rely on him, and he says, "I'm going to show myself mighty for that person." Isaiah 64:4, Isaiah says, "Since ancient times, no one has heard, no ear has perceived, no eye has seen any other God like this, who acts on behalf of those who wait on him." That's the setup. That's the way that God likes it. Psalm 50 verse 15. God says, "You call on me in the day of trouble, and I will answer you, and you will glorify me." That's the setup. God doesn't come to us with his issues and ask him for help. No, we go to him on the day of trouble, and he answers us, and we spend the rest of our lives glorifying him. That's the way that God set it up. That's the way that he likes it. He gives his support to his people. One of my favourite illustrations of this is John Piper, in one of his books. He says he used to go out jogging in his town, and there used to be a shop with a big wooden "Help Wanted" sign outside. And every so often, he'd jog past the shop and notice that the owner had put a big red sign over the top with the word "No," N-O, stuck over the top. So he said, "No help wanted." And he said, that's a great picture of the gospel. The gospel isn't a help wanted sign. That's often how it feels at churches though, isn't it? You know, can you help us raise money for the roof? Can you help us to do this? We often feel that way, but the gospel of Jesus isn't a help wanted sign. And he says a better definition of the gospel would be no help wanted, help available. That's what Jesus is about. He's the God who gives graciously. The most famous verse in the Bible is John 3:16 that said, "God so loved the world that he gave." He's a God who primarily is involved in giving. And here we see that God promises his strong support to his people. And the same is true with us. If you're struggling today, help's available, support's available. If you're struggling with your health or your marriage or work or financial difficulties or whatever it might be, there is help and there is support available today from Jesus. And then the passage goes on. Not only does God give his strategy and his support, but we see when we drop down, it says, when Sisera was told that Barak, the son of Abinoam, had gone to Mount Tabor, Sisera had called out all of his chariots, 900 chariots of iron, and all the men who were with him, from Harosheth Hagoyim to the river Kishon. And Deborah said to Barak, up, for this is the day in which the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Does not the Lord go out before you? So Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. And listen to this. And the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and all his army before Barak by the edge of the sword. We see in this day, it's the Lord who brings a victory. The Lord is victorious. The Lord brings a mighty victory in this story. And we see this all the way through the Old Testament. We see God showing himself in mighty power and bringing an incredible victory to the people of Israel. And so it's no surprise, is it, that when the Messiah came onto the scene, they were anticipating more great military victory. That's what they were looking for. But the victory that Jesus won looks entirely different to this. In fact, Jesus' victory wasn't primarily about killing his enemies, it was him dying in the place of his enemies. And that's the victory that Jesus won. The victory of Jesus looks like a crucified Messiah. It looks like someone with a crown of thorns, and nails in their hands and feet, and a spear in their side, and blood and water flowing down. That's the victory that Jesus won. And as we were singing a little bit earlier, and then 3 days later, he walked out of the grave, conquering sin, conquering death, victorious and empowered, and now sits in heaven, reigning over the nations, where one day every knee will bow before Jesus and every tongue will confess that he is Lord. That's the victory that Jesus brings. And then we see in this story, it takes a twist, because this enemy of God, Sisera, gets away and he runs to a people who camp and live in tents. And we can say this next section of the story is a bit of a parable about the dangers of camping. Many of you will know that camping is generally awful, but we learn here why you should never, ever camp. Never go to sleep in a tent. We see Sisera, he fled to the tent of Jael. And Jael came out to meet Sisera and told him to come and stay in his tent, and he went to sleep. And then Jael went over to Sisera while he was asleep and took a tent peg and killed him. And the joke is nothing like that had ever entered his head before. We see, and if you could allow me to speak allegorically for just a second, what we see is the final battle is won by a woman on her knees in the secret place. That's where the victory comes. It's by a woman on her knees in a secret place. And ultimately, there is a battle to contend for in the secret place. There's a battle in prayer that God calls you to have. And there's fights and battles that only you can fight that take place on your knees. And what's interesting in this story is that there's a victory that comes here when Jael looks at a man who's been pierced for his own sins. But we have a victory in the secret place that comes when we look to a man who wasn't pierced for his own sins, but was pierced for our sins. That's what Isaiah says. He, Jesus, he was pierced for our transgressions and crushed for our iniquity. And the punishment that was due to us landed upon him, and by his wounds were healed. And it's only as we come and behold and see a man who was pierced, not because of his mistakes, but because of ours. Not because of his errors, but because of ours. When we look to him, we can find victory in the place of prayer. And then what I love about this story is it comes to a climax. And in verse 23, all of the characters fade away. Jael and Sisera, Barak and Deborah, they fade away. And we simply see it says, on that day, God subdued Jabin, the king of Canaan, before the people. See, the message here is that all of the people fade away, and ultimately, this is God's story and God's victory. And we can get, at least I can get, so self-centered and so self-focused. You forget that the primary thing that this time and this world and this universe is about isn't about us at all. It's about Jesus. I used to know a guy, and he was an extra on the TV show The Bill. Has anyone ever seen The Bill? One or two. It's a police drama, and he was an extra in one episode, and he was an extra for about 8 seconds. But whenever anyone went to his house, he'd always somehow work into the conversation this episode, and he'd begin by saying, have you ever seen the multi-award-winning TV show The Bill? And most people would kind of act like a little bit like you, and yeah, kind of, maybe, I think. And then he'd say, well, come with me. And he'd have on VHS this one episode of The Bill, and he'd pop it in, and he'd fast forward through all the scenes to get to his 8 seconds of glory, which was the back of his head, and him turning around in the crowd. And it's as if, in his mind, that all of The Bill was about his 8-second slot. And in reality, that's how we can live our lives as well. As if all of human history and the whole of the world revolves around us and our story. When in reality, our story is only ever a part of the great story of Jesus, the King of the universe. Suffering, crucified, died, yes, killed in weakness, but risen in power, ascended on high, seated on the universe, one day to return and to take his bride as his own. That's the great picture. And then this story ends after they've contemplated and seen God's great victory in battle. It ends with a song of praise. They begin and end by worshipping the God who saved them and who brought them through and who gave them the victory. And so that's what we're going to do. We're just going to spend some time worshipping Jesus, focusing on him, being reminded of his grace and his mercy and his goodness towards us. So I just want to invite you, I'm just going to pray. And maybe today it was on my heart that maybe there are different things that you're facing right now where they feel impossible, it feels difficult, it feels huge, it feels like 900 chariots racing down on you. And we come to a God who is able to give you his support and his strength and his victory and his power. We come to a God who has already paid the price, that everything that we need, paved the way, is fully sufficient, is fully enough. So if I just invite you to stand, maybe there are those different places and areas that come to mind. And I'm just going to pray today that God would show himself mighty on behalf of those who wait on him. So we're just going to pray, we're just going to wait, and then we're going to worship Jesus.